In the autumn of 1910, on a dirt road winding out of the state of Oaxaca toward a green valley called Valle Nacional, a man walks in a line of other men, roped at the wrists, guarded by mounted police in gray uniforms. He was told, weeks earlier in a Mexico City street, that there was good work waiting in the south. 5 pesos a day, they said, easy labor, a fair contract. He signed a paper he could not read. He is not a criminal. He is one of thousands funneled each year into what the American journalist John Kenneth Turner, who walked into that valley in disguise, would call a slave country hiding behind the mask of a republic. Turner estimated that of every 100 who entered Valle Nacional, 2/3 were dead within 7 or 8 months, and almost none survived beyond a year. This man does not yet know that. He only knows the rope and the heat rising off the road, and the year, 1910, the 34th year of the rule of Porfirio Díaz. To understand his suffering, you must understand the machine that produced it. Porfirio Díaz had seized the presidency in 1876 and had never truly let it go. He was 80 years old in 1910, and that September, as he presided over the lavish centennial of Mexican independence, fireworks over the capital, foreign dignitaries in silk, an estimated 20 million pesos spent on the celebration. The vast majority of his countrymen lived in conditions that had not improved in a century. Roughly 11,000 haciendas, great landed estates, controlled most of the arable land in the country. A tiny elite of landowners held the soil. Some 95% of rural families owned no land at all. The people who worked that land were peons, and the system that held them was called debt peonage. The mathematics of that system were merciless. A peon earned perhaps 25 to 35 centavos for a day that began before dawn and ended after dark. A wage that had barely moved in 100 years, while the price of corn, the food of the poor, climbed steadily upward. He was rarely paid in coin. He was paid in scrip, in paper vols, redeemable only at the hacienda's own store, the tienda de raya, where prices were set by the master and the ledger was kept by the master. A man borrowed to eat, borrowed to bury his dead, borrowed to marry, and the debt was written in a book he could not audit. When he died, the debt did not. It passed to his sons. Whole families were born already owing, bound to the estate not by chains but by arithmetic, an inheritance of bondage disguised as a loan. Over all of this presided an ideology. Díaz surrounded himself with advisors the country nicknamed the científicos, the scientific ones, technocrats and financiers, men like the finance minister José Yves Limantour, who believed in order, in foreign investment, in progress measured by railroads and export tonnage. They spoke the language of positivism and social Darwinism, and in that language the suffering of the Indian and the peon was not a crime but a natural condition, the price of a modern Mexico. The trains they built carried the henequen fiber and the silver and the coffee to foreign ports. They also carried the deported and the enslaved to the plantations of the South. Because 1910 was not only the world of the peon, in the far northwest, in the deserts of Sonora, an entire people was being erased. The Yaqui had fought for their land and their river for generations, and Díaz had resolved to end the matter. On the 18th of January, 1900, at a mountain stronghold called Mazacoba, federal troops under General Lorenzo Torres killed some 397 Yaqui men, women, and children in a single day. Others, refusing capture, threw themselves from the cliffs. What followed the battles was quieter, and, in its way, worse. By government order, Yaqui families were rounded up, men taken from their fields, mothers with infants, and marched and shipped across the length of the country to the plantations of Yucatán. Somewhere between 8 and 15,000 were deported in the space of a decade, from a people who numbered perhaps 30,000. Along the exile road, across 200 miles of mountains on foot, the weak died where they fell, and their bodies were left at the roadside. And in Yucatán itself, in the flat white-hot country around Mérida, the last destination waited. The henequen estates, where the sharp-leaved agave was cut for the twine that bound the wheat harvests of the world. Turner counted roughly 50 planter families, the Henequen kings, who had made Mérida, by some accounts, the city with more millionaires per capita than anywhere on Earth. Beneath them, an enslaved population that later estimates placed above 100,000 souls, Maya bound by inherited debt, Yaqui shipped in from the desert, Chinese and Korean laborers, and men tricked from the streets of the capital. This is the world of 1910. Not the Mexico of the centennial fireworks, but the Mexico beneath it, the country that was, that very year, about to catch fire. The man on the road to Valle Nacional cannot see the flame yet, but it is coming for the system that put him on that road. The daily reality. The day on a henequen plantation in Yucatán began in darkness at the sound of a bell. In the great walled compounds outside Mérida, the enslaved were driven from their barracks before dawn and assembled for roll call. According to the testimony Turner gathered in 1908, posing as a wealthy investor to walk freely among the planters, roll call frequently opened not with a count, but with a beating, a ritual flogging administered to men who had done nothing, so that they would remember what awaited them if they did. Then came the fields and the leaves. The henequen agave is a plant of long, stiff, sword-like leaves edged and tipped with thorns. The quota was 2,000 leaves cut and cleaned per man per day. A worker moved down the rows in the rising tropical heat, bending, cutting, trimming, his hands opening on the spines until they were a map of small wounds. If he failed to meet the 2,000, he was beaten at the evening roll call, as he had been beaten at the morning one. There was little water and less food. The overseers, the mayordomos, watched from horseback with the whip coiled at the saddle. Men worked, as the accounts put it, from dawn to dusk in the blazing sun. And at night, they were locked into barred dormitories so that the day could begin again exactly as before. The food was calculated, like the wage, to keep a body barely working. The ration was thin, tortillas, a little bean paste, sometimes a scrap of dried fish or rancid meat, measured out at the plantation store and, of course, charged against the ledger. Malnutrition was constant. Into bodies weakened by hunger and heat came the diseases of the tropics: malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, the fevers that swept the barracks and were noted in no official record. There was no medicine worth the name and no rest for the sick. Turner reported the figure that would follow him for the rest of his life. At least 2/3 of the Yaqui shipped to Yucatán were dead before the end of their first year. They were not worked to build something. They were worked to death and replaced. In Valle Nacional, in the tobacco country of Oaxaca, the arithmetic of death was even steeper. This was where the enganchados went, the hooked ones, lured by labor agents with promises of good wages and delivered under contract to the planters for a fee of some 50 pesos a head. The contract was the fiction that let the country call it labor instead of slavery. The reality was a valley from which almost no one returned. Turner described men so broken by fever and beatings that they could no longer stand, laid out to die because it was cheaper to buy a new contract worker than to heal a sick one. The dead were carried out at dawn. The living were counted and sent back into the fields. Punishment was not an exception in this world. It was the mechanism, the whip, the stocks, the dark cell. These were the instruments that made the ledger enforceable. A peon who tried to leave a hacienda without settling his debt could be hunted, returned, and flogged, and the law stood behind the master. The rural police, the mounted rurales in their tight gray suits and broad hats, were the visible edge of that law across the countryside. They were also the instrument of the ley fuga, the law of flight, the practice of shooting a prisoner in the back and recording that he had been killed while trying to escape. It was a phrase everyone understood. It meant that a man in custody could be executed on a whim, and the paperwork would call it his own fault. And the suffering was not confined to the plantations of the South. In the industrial pockets of Diaz's Mexico, the same fist closed on those who dared to organize. In June of 1906, the copper miners of Cananea in Sonora worked harder and paid less than the American miners beside them, went on strike. The response was gunfire. Armed men, including volunteers who crossed from Arizona, fired on the crowd, and more than 20 workers lay dead. In January of 1907, The textile workers of Rio Blanco and Veracruz struck against the company's stores and the endless hours. Soldiers opened fire on them in the street. The bodies, by some accounts, were loaded onto railway flat cars and carried away to be dumped so that no one could count them. This was the daily reality of Diaz's order. A peace maintained by the whip in the field and the rifle in the town. A prosperity for the few, built on the measured, deliberate exhaustion of the many. It was a system that had learned to extract everything a human being contained and to write the cost in a book the worker could never close. The erasure. To break a body is a simple thing. The Diaz system did something more thorough. It set out to break the person inside the body, to erase the name, the family, the language, the memory of having ever been free. This was the deepest cruelty of 1910, and it left the faintest paper trail because its purpose was to leave nothing behind at all. It began with separation. When the Yaqui were deported from Sonora, the state did not simply move them, it dismantled them. At the concentration camp of San Marcos, families were deliberately broken apart. Husbands sent one direction, wives another, children scattered, so that no unit strong enough to resist or remember could survive the journey. A man arrived in Yucatán alone, stripped of everyone who had known him as a father, a husband, a son of a particular village on a particular river. On the henequen estates, the destruction of the family was completed by decree. Yaqui women, torn from their own men, were forbidden to marry other Yaqui and were forced instead to marry the Chinese laborers on the plantation. A policy designed with cold precision to ensure that the children born on the estate would have no people, no nation, no inheritance except the debt of the place that made them. And every child born into that bondage had a price. By the accounts Turner gathered, an infant born on the plantation was worth up to $1,000 to the owner. A new human being entered the world already listed as property, already an asset in a ledger. This was erasure as policy. The whip enforced the day, the ledger enforced the lifetime, but the breaking of the family was meant to enforce forever, to guarantee that the people crushed by the system would not even be able to hand down the knowledge that another life had once been possible. For those who resisted with words, the regime kept a different set of instruments. Mexico in 1910 was a country of political prisons. In the capital stood Belén, its cells overflowing. On the coast at Veracruz, rising black out of the harbor, stood the fortress of San Juan de Ulúa, and beneath it the dungeons the prisoners called Las Tinajas, cells at the waterline, dark, wet, airless, where a man could be lowered and simply forgotten. Editors who printed the truth, organizers who spoke of rights, workers who signed the wrong petition, they disappeared into these places without trial and often without record. The point was not only to punish the individual, it was to teach everyone watching that dissent was a form of suicide. And yet, against all of it, people resisted. The most dangerous voices came from a family of brothers named Flores Magón. Ricardo Flores Magón, from his newspaper Regeneración, smuggled across the border and passed hand to hand, denounced the dictatorship in language that could get a man imprisoned merely for possessing it. The Mexican Liberal Party he helped lead issued in 1906, a program that read like a prophecy of everything the coming revolution would demand. An end to debt peonage, an 8-hour day, the abolition of the tanda de raya, the return of stolen land. For this, the Magón brothers were hunted across 2 countries, jailed in Mexico and in the United States, their presses seized, their allies shot. The regime understood that ideas were the one thing the whip could not reach, and it pursued them with a special fury. Because by 1910, the ideas were spreading faster than the rurales could ride. In the north, a wealthy young landowner from Coahuila named Francisco Porfirio Madero had done the unthinkable. He had run for president against Porfirio Díaz. He wrote a book arguing that the endless re-elections were destroying the nation, and he traveled the country drawing crowds that frightened the old man in the capital. So Díaz did what the system always did. He had Madero arrested, jailed him in the city of San Luis Potosí through the election of 1910, and then declared himself the winner once again, by the usual near-unanimous and entirely fictional margin. It was his 8th such victory. But this time, the machine had made a fatal error. Madero was not a peon to be flogged or a Yaqui to be shipped away. He slipped free, crossed into Texas, and from San Antonio issued a document dated the 5th of October, 1910, the Plan de San Luis Potosi. It declared the election void, named Diaz a usurper, and called upon the people of Mexico to rise in arms at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 20th of November, 1910. Its watchword was as old as the grievance behind it: Sufragio efectivo, no reelección, a real vote and no re-election. For 34 years, the system had erased its victims one by one, quietly, thoroughly, in valleys and dungeons and ledgers. Now the erased were being handed a date and a reason and each other. The book that could never be closed was about to be thrown into the fire. The most vulnerable and the reckoning. Consider at the end the ones who could not fight back. The child, the old man, the dying. They are the truest measure of a civilization, because they are the ones a just society protects and an unjust one discards. In the Mexico of 1910, they were discarded with an efficiency that still stops the breath. Consider the child born on a henequen estate outside Mérida. He entered the world already priced, already owed, valued it up to $1,000 as the property of a man he would never dare look in the eye. He would never see a school. He would grow, if he grew at all, into the 2,000-leaf quota, into the roll call beating, into the tienda de raya and its bottomless ledger. His mother had been forced into a marriage designed to leave him without a people. His father, if he had one, might be a Yaqui already dead of fever in the fields. This child was not the exception in Diaz's Mexico. Across 11,000 haciendas, millions of children were born into inherited debt, the sons and daughters of peons, owing before they could walk, the entire arc of their lives already written in a book kept by another man's hand. Consider the elderly Yaqui on the exile road, marched 200 miles from the only desert he had ever known toward a green country that would kill him. Along that road, the accounts tell us, the women and children who could not withstand the 3-week crossing of the mountains simply died, and their bodies were left where they lay beside the trail. No grave, no name, no marker, only the next column of the deported stepping past. In Valle Nacional and on the henequen estates, the dead were carried out at dawn and buried without ceremony in unmarked ground, or not buried at all. An entire population was being consumed and erased so completely that the historians who came later would have to argue about how many hundreds of thousands had even existed to be destroyed. This was the reckoning that could not be postponed. A society had been built in which the suffering of the many was not an accident to be corrected, but a resource to be harvested, in which children were assets, families were obstacles to be dismantled, and human beings were entries in a ledger written off when they died. Porfirio Díaz had brought Mexico railroads and foreign banks and a centennial of fireworks, and beneath that glittering surface he had built one of the most complete engines of human suffering the hemisphere had produced since the abolition of open slavery. The scientificos had called it order. Turner, who had walked through it, called it barbarous. And so it broke. When the 20th of November came, the rising was scattered and uncertain at first. A few hundred men here, a raid there, Madero himself slipping back across the border to a revolt not yet fully lit. But the grievance beneath it was 34 years deep and a nationwide, and it did not go out. In the north, a former bandit and muleteer named Doroteo Arango, whom the country would come to know as Pancho Villa, gathered horsemen in Chihuahua. In the sugar country of Morelos, in the village of Anenequilco, a quiet horseman named Emiliano Zapata took up the oldest grievance of all, the stolen village lands, under a banner that said only Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. Within months, the scattered risings had become an army. Within a year, Diaz would sail into exile aboard a German steamer, the old man watching his order dissolve behind him. But the fire, once lit, would not be easily controlled. The revolution that began as a call for an honest vote became a decade of war, and the suffering did not end with the tyrant's fall. It changed shape and spread. Armies crossed and recrossed the country. Harvests burned. Famine and typhus followed the soldiers into villages that had never sent a man to either side. By the time the guns finally cooled, the historians would estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 million Mexicans had died. In battle, yes, but far more from hunger and disease and the collapse of the ordinary world. It is a staggering figure, and it is the price a civilization pays when, for 34 years, it chooses to build its prosperity on the measured destruction of its own people. That is the truth beneath the fireworks of 1910. A nation had been taught, in its haciendas and its henequen fields and its drowned dungeons, that some human beings were merely fuel. The Mexican Revolution was the moment the fuel refused. It was terrible, and it was necessary, and its dead, the peon and the Yaqui, the striker and the child born already owing, are the witnesses who will not let us look away. They remind us of a thing every generation is tempted to forget, that no order built on the suffering of the powerless, however grand its monuments, however unanimous its elections, is ever as permanent as it believes. It only waits for the 20th of November,